Natalie, how can you hide such information from me?
It serves you right for cheating on me with my best friend.
She took my husband, my best friend, my whole life, and I smiled, signed the papers, and walked away. What she never knew was going to destroy everything she thought she'd won. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman when she finally decides she is done. It is not the silence of weakness. It is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of a woman who has seen enough, who has calculated the cost of staying and found it too high, who has weighed everything she built against everything she lost and decided, quietly, coldly, without a single tear, that she will not beg for what was never truly hers to keep. That was the silence that lived. Inside Natalie Reeves on the morning, she picked up the phone and called her attorney. She did not cry. She did not shake. She sat at the edge of her custom-upholstered bedroom chair in her 4,000 square foot home in Buckhead, Georgia, crossed her legs at the ankle the way her grandmother always told her a lady should, and she made the call that would change 4 lives forever. Natalie Reeves was 38 years old, and she had built something extraordinary from nothing. She had grown up in the West End of Atlanta, the second daughter of a retired MARTA bus driver named Harold and a school cafeteria supervisor named Cynthia. Her parents were not rich, but they were fierce. They were the kind of people who believed with religious conviction that a black woman in America had to be twice as good, 3 times as prepared, and 4 times as patient just to be seen. Natalie had taken those lessons and run with them. She graduated valedictorian from Frederick Douglass High School, earned a full academic scholarship to Spelman College, and then completed her MBA at the Goizueta Business School at Emory University with a concentration in finance. She was 26 years old when she launched her first financial wellness app with $40,000. She had saved from 2 jobs she worked simultaneously through graduate school. She was 31 when that app was acquired for $11 million. She was 34 when the second company she founded, a wealth management platform design, specifically for black households, received its first series, a funding round of $22 million. By the time she was 38 and sitting in that chair making that phone call, Natalie Reeves was worth in excess of $40 million, but almost no one knew it. That was entirely intentional. Her husband, Marcus Reeves, did not know it. Her best friend, Dominique Carter, did not know it. Her in-laws, her neighbors, the women at her church, none of them knew it. Natalie had spent years constructing a life that looked comfortable, but not extravagant, successful, but not conspicuous. She drove a 3-year-old Lexus instead of the Ferrari she could have paid cash for. She wore good clothes, but not designer labels on every inch of her body. She gave generously to causes she believed in, but she did it quietly, without fanfare. She had learned long ago that in certain circles, a black woman with real money was a target for jealousy, for exploitation, for the particular kind of resentment that people dress up as concern or advice. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had been private. And now, sitting in that chair on a Tuesday morning in October, she was about to be free. She had known about Marcus and Dominique for 4 months. She had not confronted them. She had not thrown dishes or screamed into pillows. She had done what Natalie Reeves always did when faced with a problem that required a solution. She gathered information, she made a plan, and she executed it without emotion. She had consulted with her attorney, a brilliant and ruthless woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in high-asset divorce proceedings, and she had quietly begun the process of separating her financial life from Marcus's in ways so subtle and so clean that even her forensic accountant said it was the most elegant financial extraction she had ever seen. By the time Natalie was ready to file, Marcus Reeves had no idea what was coming. He thought he was married to a woman who managed a small boutique consulting firm that brought in maybe $250,000 a year. He thought they lived comfortably on a combined income that put them solidly in the upper middle class. He thought Natalie Reeves was a smart woman, a good woman, a hard-working woman, but ultimately a woman who needed him, who depended on the stability he provided as a senior vice president at a regional investment bank. He had no idea, and that Natalie had decided, was going to be his greatest humiliation. Marcus Reeves was 41 years old and handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, not because they worked particularly hard at it, but because the universe handed them good bones and a clean smile, and they learned early how to use those things to move through the world with minimum resistance. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair that had begun to silver at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished, rather than old. He had grown up in College Park, the son of a Baptist deacon and a real estate agent, and he had been taught that a man's worth was measured in his ability to provide, to lead, to be the anchor of his family. He believed this with all of his heart. He also believed, apparently, that providing and leading did not preclude sleeping with his wife's best friend in hotel rooms on the 3rd floor of the Lowe's Atlanta Hotel every other Tuesday afternoon. Dominique Carter was 37 years old and had been Natalie's best friend for 22 years. They had met as freshmen at Spelman, two girls from working class Atlanta families who recognized each other immediately as kindred spirits, ambitious, driven, determined to build lives that looked nothing like the ones they had come from. They had studied together, cried together, celebrated together. Dominique had been a bridesmaid at Natalie's wedding. She had held Natalie's hand through the miscarriage that Natalie had never told Marcus the full truth about. She had been there for every milestone, every heartbreak, every quiet Sunday afternoon on Natalie's back porch with wine and gospel music, and the kind of honesty that women reserve only for their very closest people. She had also, for the past 14 months, been sleeping with Natalie's husband. Natalie had done the math. The way Natalie found out was almost embarrassingly ordinary. She had not hired a private investigator, though she later would for documentation purposes. She had not gone through Marcus's phone, though she later would find what she needed there too. She had found out the way women so often find out, because God or fate or the universe, whichever one you believe in, decided it was time for the truth to breathe. She had been leaving a business dinner downtown in early June, her car brought around by a valet, when she looked up and saw Marcus's car, his distinctive navy blue Cadillac CT6 with the personalized plate that read Im Reeves 1, parked in the hotel garage across the street. He had told her he was in Charlotte for a client meeting. He had texted her from what he said was a restaurant on the corner of College and Tryon. She had stood on that sidewalk in downtown Atlanta for 3 full minutes, looking at that car, and she had felt something shift inside her that she could only describe later to Patricia as a door closing. Not slamming, closing, with a quiet final click. She went home. She put on her bonnet. She read 3 chapters of a book about the history of Black Wall Street. She fell asleep before Marcus came home. In the morning, she made coffee, fed their dog, a golden doodle named Justice, and sat across from Marcus at the kitchen island while he told her the client meeting had gone well, and that they might be looking at a partnership opportunity with a firm out of Raleigh. She listened. She nodded. She asked the right questions, and behind her eyes, in the part of herself that no one had ever truly accessed, she began to plan. The next 4 months were a masterclass in control. Natalie moved quietly through the logistics of dismantling a financial life that Marcus did not know existed. She worked with Patricia Okafor to structure a divorce filing that was ironclad, comprehensive, and designed to move fast. She hired a private investigator named Terrence Webb, a former DeKalb County detective who was meticulous and discreet, who provided her with photographs, hotel receipts, and timestamps that documented 23 separate occasions on which Marcus Reeves met Dominique Carter at various locations across metro Atlanta. She gathered her documentation. She protected her assets. She prepared herself emotionally, not by grieving, because she had done her grieving in the parking garage that June night, but by reminding herself, again and again, who she was and what she had built and what she refused to lose any more of. And on a Tuesday morning in October, she called Patricia Okafor and said 4 words: "File the papers today." Marcus Reeves was served at his office. Natalie had timed it deliberately, 3 in the afternoon, when the floor was at its busiest, when his assistant and 3 of his colleagues would see the process server walk up to his desk. She had been advised this was aggressive. She had said, "I know." The papers listed irreconcilable differences as the grounds, which was true as far as it went. But they also contained an addendum, prepared by Patricia, that outlined a proposed settlement based on the marital assets as Marcus understood them to exist. The settlement was generous, straightforward, and designed to be accepted quickly. Natalie did not want a long fight. She did not want Marcus's money. She did not want the house. She simply wanted out, clean and fast, and she was willing to let. Marcus believed he had gotten a reasonable deal in order to make that happen with speed. What she was not willing to do was let anyone in that courtroom, or anywhere near that process, understand the full scope of what she actually had. Not yet. That revelation was coming, but it would come on her terms, and at the time of her choosing. Marcus called her 17 times between 3 and 7 that evening. She let every call go to voicemail. She was at her mother's house in the West End, sitting at the kitchen table where she had done her homework as a child, eating Cynthia's baked chicken and listening to her mother hum along to the radio, and she felt, for the first time in months, something that felt like peace. Her father sat in his recliner in the next room watching the evening news, and when Natalie walked past to refill her water glass, Harold Reeves reached out and took his daughter's hand without saying a word. He squeezed it once. She squeezed back. That was enough. Marcus finally came to the house at 8:30. He still had a key. He let himself in and found Natalie sitting in the living room reading, Justice asleep at her feet. He was wild-eyed and disheveled in a way she had never seen him before. His tie was loosened and his jacket was rumpled, and he looked at her like she had taken something from him, like she was the one who had transgressed. And that look, that particular arrangement of his handsome features into something approaching injured entitlement, confirmed. For Natalie, everything she had needed to feel confirmed. She closed her book. She set it on the side table. She looked at him calmly. He said, "What is this, Natalie? What are you doing?" She said, "I think the documents are fairly self-explanatory, Marcus." He said, "You can't just file for divorce without talking to me first. We are married. We are supposed to handle things together." She looked at him for a long moment. Justice stirred at her feet, lifted his head, looked at Marcus, and then laid his head back down with what Natalie could only interpret as judgment. She said, "I'd like you to leave. You can communicate with me through Patricia Okafor's office going forward." He stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried 3 more times to start a sentence that he could not finish, and then he left. He did not slam the door. He closed it behind him with a quiet, final click, the same sound, Natalie thought, that the door inside her had made on that June sidewalk. She picked up her book. She found her page. She continued reading. What Marcus Reeves did not do in any of those 17 voicemails, or in that living room conversation, or in the frantic series of text messages he sent over the following 72 hours was deny it. He did not say, "I don't know what you think you found, but you are wrong." He did not mount a defense. He went instead to Dominique. He went to her apartment in Midtown, the one on the 14th floor with the view of the skyline that Natalie had helped Dominique furnish 18 months ago, back when Dominique had just moved in and had called, Natalie asking for advice on throw pillows. He went to Dominique, and Dominique opened her door, and in the morning he was still there. Natalie knew this because Terence Webb was still on the case, and because Natalie believed in being thorough. Dominique called once, just once, on the Wednesday evening after the papers were filed. Natalie stared at her name on the screen for 4 full rings, and then pressed decline. She felt nothing. That was how she knew she was ready. The offices of Okafor & Associates occupied the entire 22nd floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Road, and the view from Patricia Okafor's corner office on a clear November morning was the kind of view that reminded you, if you needed reminding, that Atlanta was a serious city with serious ambitions and serious power moving through its streets below. Patricia Okafor was 53 years old, Igbo Nigerian by heritage and Georgia-bred by upbringing, and she had built her family law practice into one of the most quietly feared in the state. She did not advertise. She did not appear on billboards. Her clients came to her by referral only, and they came because she had a reputation earned over 27 years of practice for being absolutely uncompromising in the protection of her clients' interests. She was also, when it was warranted, absolutely devastating to opposing counsel. She had a talent for stillness in the courtroom that unnerved people who did not know her and terrified people who did. She had known Natalie Reeves for 6 years. Natalie had first come to her not about a marriage, but about a business acquisition, the sale of her first company, and Patricia had been so impressed by the precision of Natalie's thinking and the careful architecture of the company she had built that she had offered to refer her to several clients who might benefit from her wealth management platform. They had become, over the years, something that existed in the space between professional relationship and friendship. They respected each other enormously. They were honest with each other in ways that people often are not when money is involved. And they met for dinner twice a year at a restaurant of Patricia's, choosing where they talked about books, about the state of black entrepreneurship in the South, about their mothers, and occasionally about work. When Natalie had called Patricia in June, 2 weeks after the parking garage, Patricia had listened without interruption and then said, "Tell me everything you want. Not what you think you can get, everything you want." That question had oriented the entire 4-month preparation that followed. On the morning of the first formal meeting with Marcus's attorney, Natalie arrived at Patricia's office at 9:15 in a camel wool coat and dark brown leather boots, her natural hair pinned up in a way that was professional without being severe, her face composed in the expression that Marcus had once described, early in their marriage, as her boardroom face, the one where she looked like she was listening pleasantly, but was actually 3 steps ahead of everything being said in the room. She accepted a coffee from Patricia's assistant, sat down in one of the leather chairs across from Patricia's desk, and said, "Is he bringing James Carter?" Patricia said, "He is." James Carter and a junior associate. Carter billed himself in $225,000 worth of business with Marcus's firm last year, so there is an existing relationship there that Marcus thinks is an advantage. Natalie nodded. "It's not." Patricia smiled slightly. "It is absolutely not." James Carter, no relation to Dominique, was a perfectly competent Atlanta family law attorney, with a pleasant manner and a solid record in mid-range divorce proceedings. He was not, however, in Patricia Okafor's class, and he knew it. Every Atlanta attorney who practiced family law knew it. What James Carter was banking on, Natalie understood, was that this would be a straightforward dissolution of a marriage of moderate means, where the primary dispute would be over the house, the retirement accounts, and perhaps some stock options that Marcus held with his employer. He was banking on Natalie being a woman with a consulting business and a bruised heart. He was banking on settling this in 2 or 3 sessions and billing 40 or 50 hours. He had, Natalie thought, badly miscalculated. The meeting was held in Patricia's largest conference room, which had floor-to-ceiling windows along one side and a long mahogany table that could seat 20. Natalie and Patricia sat on one side. Marcus and James Carter and a young associate whose name Natalie did not retain sat on the other. Natalie had not seen Marcus since the night he came to the house, and she looked at him across the table with the clear, unclouded gaze of someone observing a stranger. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal Hickey Freeman that he saved for important client meetings, and he had gotten a fresh haircut, and he looked good. She acknowledged to herself with no particular emotion, the way you might acknowledge that the weather is nice. He did not look at her for the first 2 minutes of preliminary conversation, and when he finally did, she gave him a small, professional nod that made the color rise in his neck. James Carter opened by proposing a settlement framework built around equal division of the marital home, which carried a mortgage balance of $800,000 against a market value of approximately $1.2 million, and a split of the retirement and investment accounts that both parties had disclosed in their preliminary financial statements. He was pleasant about it. He used words like equitable and collaborative and moving. Forward. Patricia listened with her hands folded on the table and her expression politely interested. And then when James Carter was done, she opened the folder in front of her and began to speak. What happened in the next 47 minutes would become, in the retelling, one of the more remarkable scenes of Natalie Reeves's life. Patricia laid out, with the methodical precision of a surgeon, the full financial picture of her client's life. Not the partial picture that Marcus had lived adjacent to for 8 years, but the real picture, the complete picture. The picture that included 2 technology companies, one acquired and one currently, valued at $34 million. Based on a third-party appraisal conducted the previous month, 3 investment portfolios managed under business entities that predated the marriage, a real estate holding company that owned 4 rental properties in the Atlanta metropolitan area, and liquid assets across multiple accounts that brought Natalie's total personal net worth, as of the most recent financial statements, to $41,700,000. Patricia placed the financial disclosure document in the center of the table. With the gentleness of someone setting down something fragile, she slid it across to James Carter. She said, "My client intends to be entirely transparent about her financial position, as required by Georgia disclosure law. We have prepared a comprehensive disclosure package for your review." The silence that followed was extraordinary. It was the kind of silence that has texture. You could almost feel it, pressing against the walls of the room, filling the space between the bodies at the table, settling over everything like a first snow. James Carter opened the disclosure document. His junior associate, who had been taking notes with the quiet confidence of someone who thinks they understand the shape of the proceeding, stopped writing, and Marcus Reeves, across the table, went through a sequence of expressions that Natalie watched with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was its close neighbor. He went from polite attentiveness to confused attention to a particular kind of blankness that she had seen on his face only twice before. Once when his father had a health scare, and once when he missed a critical trade at work. A blankness that meant the information arriving at his brain was too large for his face to process it in real time. He said very quietly, "What is this?" James Carter put a hand on Marcus's arm in the way that attorneys sometimes restrain their clients from the worst version of whatever they are about to do. He said, "Marcus." Marcus said, still quietly, but with something beginning to crack underneath it. "What is this, Patricia?" Patricia said, with complete evenness. "It is your wife's financial disclosure statement, as required under Georgia law OCGA, Section 1914. My client has complied fully with all disclosure requirements. I trust your client will do the same." Marcus looked across the table at Natalie. Natalie looked back at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked at him with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had been underestimated for a very long time and had spent that time doing something extraordinarily useful with the space that underestimation had provided. She had, over 8 years of marriage, managed $40 million in assets that Marcus did not know existed, had made investment decisions of staggering consequence, had built a wealth management company that was currently in negotiation for a potential Series B funding round of $60 million, and Marcus had spent that entire time believing that he was the primary financial engine of their household, that his SVP salary was what kept them in their Buckhead house and sent them on their annual vacations and funded the retirement accounts that were, it now turned out, a rounding error in the context of Natalie Reeves's actual financial life. He had believed himself the provider. He had believed himself necessary. He had, it turned out, been unnecessary for years, not in the way that marriages are built on more than money, but in the specific, particular way that a man who defines himself through provision and control finds most devastating. He had been entirely replaceable as a financial force in Natalie's life before the first anniversary of their wedding. The meeting adjourned with James Carter, requesting 2 weeks to review the disclosure materials. Patricia agreed pleasantly. As Natalie and Patricia stood to leave, Marcus said, "Natalie." Just her name. The way he said it was different from anything she had heard from him in years, stripped of the confidence, the authority, the easy assumption that she was a fixed thing in his orbit. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he had not known was there. She turned. She looked at him. She said, "My attorney will be in touch, Marcus." She picked up her coat. She walked out. Patricia walked beside her. In the elevator, going down, Patricia said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "He had absolutely no idea." Natalie pressed the lobby button. She said, "No, He did not. The elevator descended. Natalie watched the floor numbers fall. She thought about her mother's kitchen and her father's hand, and the way Justice had looked at Marcus that night in the living room. She thought about a parking garage in June and a door closing. She said nothing else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Word began to move through certain circles of Atlanta society, the way word always moves through close communities, not in headlines, but in whispers, in the coded language of women at brunch who say, "I heard something about Marcus." Reeves with a particular lowering of the voice that communicates volumes without specifics. Natalie had not told anyone anything. Patricia's office was sealed tighter than a vault, but Marcus had clearly told Dominique, because Dominique Carter spent the 48 hours after the conference room meeting calling Natalie from 2 different numbers, sending text messages of escalating emotional register, and eventually appearing, unannounced, at the offices of Natalie's consulting firm on a Wednesday afternoon. Natalie was in a meeting. Her office manager, a young woman named Kezia, who had worked for Natalie for 3 years and who was, as a consequence, entirely loyal and entirely perceptive, came to the door of the conference room and said quietly, "There's someone here asking for you. She says her name is Dominique Carter." Natalie looked up from the quarterly projections on the screen. She said, "Tell her I'm unavailable. Offer her water and tell her my next available appointment is 3 weeks from Thursday." Kezia's expression did not change. She said, "Of course." She left. Through the glass wall of the conference room, Natalie watched Kezia deliver this message to a woman whose body language went from hopeful to stricken to furious in approximately 15 seconds. Dominique left. She did not take the water. Marcus's attorney filed a formal request for financial verification, essentially a challenge to the disclosed figures, a common response when opposing counsel cannot quite believe what they are looking at. Patricia responded within 48 hours with 47 pages of supporting documentation, including 3 years of audited financial statements for both of Natalie's companies, the acquisition documents from the sale of her first app, current valuation reports, and a letter from the forensic accountant who had been retained to certify the accuracy of all disclosed assets. James Carter, who Natalie imagined must have been having a very uncomfortable week, filed no further challenges to the financial disclosure. He began instead to request meetings with Patricia to discuss settlement terms, which was precisely what Natalie had anticipated and precisely what she had prepared for. Marcus Reeves was not a stupid man. He was a proud one, which is a different thing entirely, and pride was making it very difficult for him to navigate the reality he was now living in. He had filed for divorce, and here Natalie allowed herself, privately, a single raised eyebrow of appreciation for the irony, from a woman whose financial resources meant that the best divorce attorney in the city of Atlanta was entirely at her disposal at no meaningful cost to her life, while Marcus was calculating attorneys' fees against his savings and wondering whether his SVP salary, which was substantial but not extraordinary, was going to leave him with any real leverage in a proceeding where his wife's disclosed assets were 41 times what he had assumed her worth to be. He was also living, at this point, in Dominique's midtown apartment because Natalie had, with Patricia's guidance, requested a temporary order that gave her exclusive use of the marital home during the pendency of the divorce proceedings, and the judge, looking at the financial disclosures and the evidence of the affair and the overall equities of the situation, had granted it. Marcus was sleeping on Dominique's couch or in Dominique's bed, depending on which version of the story you believed, and he was eating Dominique's food, and he was experiencing, for the first time in his adult life, the particular vertigo of a man who believed himself the axis of a world that has just revealed itself to have been rotating perfectly, fine without him. Dominique Carter had spent 14 months telling herself a story, and the story went like this. Marcus Reeves was in an unhappy marriage to a woman who was good but not right for him, a woman who was so absorbed in her work and her plans and her careful, controlled way of moving through the world that she had left no room for Marcus to feel truly seen, truly wanted, truly chosen. The story Dominique told herself was that what she and Marcus had was not a betrayal, but a recognition. Two people who had found in each other something that circumstance had prevented them from finding at the right time. She had told herself this story in the dark of hotel rooms and in the careful choreography of their public interactions, which had to appear as they always had. Easy, familiar, the natural warmth of a man and his wife's best friend, while carrying underneath it the weight of everything they were hiding. She had told herself this story, right up until the moment that Marcus Reeves sat down in her living room and told her that Natalie's lawyer had disclosed in a divorce proceeding that Dominique had been anticipating with a complicated mixture of guilt and excitement that Natalie Reeves was worth $41 million. The story stopped working after that. It was not, to be clear, that Dominique was a purely mercenary person. She was not. She was a deeply flawed person who had made a catastrophic choice and rationalized it elaborately, which is a different thing from someone who calculated the value of a friendship and decided it was worth sacrificing for financial gain. She had genuinely believed, or made herself believe, that she and Marcus were something real. But she was also a woman who had grown up watching Natalie build and build and build, who had sat across from Natalie at 100 brunches and dinner tables and seen in her oldest friend a level of self-possession and quiet confidence that had always inspired her, and sometimes, if she was honest in the way that we are only honest with ourselves in the very small hours of very bad nights, made her feel like she was always standing slightly in Natalie's shadow. She had loved Natalie. She had also, without ever quite naming it, resented what Natalie seemed to have that she could not seem to hold on to. The steadiness, the vision, the sense of always knowing exactly who she was and where she was going. And Marcus had told her, in those hotel rooms and in those quiet hours, that Dominique was different, that with Dominique he could breathe, that Dominique made him feel things that his marriage had stopped making him feel. She had held that like a treasure. What she had not held, what she was now, understanding she had catastrophically failed to account for, was the possibility that Natalie had known, not suspected, known, had known for months, and had said nothing, and had moved quietly through the preparation of a legal proceeding that was now positioned to leave. Marcus with a settlement that, while reasonable by the standards of the marital estate as it appeared on the surface, was comically disproportionate to the actual assets that Natalie controlled. Dominique understood. Now, sitting in her midtown apartment, across from a man who was rapidly cycling through something that looked like grief and fury and helplessness in equal measure, that Natalie had always been the most dangerous person in the room. The difference was that Dominique had spent 22 years thinking the danger was a competition, a comparison, a question of who was doing better. It was not. The danger was that Natalie Reeves had been playing an entirely different game, a longer game, a quieter game, a game whose rules Dominique had not even known existed, and she had already won it before anyone else in the room understood they were playing. Marcus, for his part, was doing what Marcus always did when the ground shifted under him. He was asserting himself more forcefully in the direction he believed things should go, which was the wrong direction. He had instructed James Carter to contest the proposed settlement, to push for a larger share of the marital assets, including Natalie's business interests, on the grounds that as her spouse he had provided emotional and domestic support over the course of the marriage that had materially contributed to her ability to build those assets. This argument had some theoretical legal basis. Georgia courts do consider the contributions of both spouses in an equitable distribution proceeding, and James Carter had presented it with the professional competence of a man who is doing his job while privately understanding that it will not work. Patricia Okafor had responded to it with a 22-page brief that was, by every account of the attorneys who read it, a surgical deconstruction of every factual and legal basis for Marcus's claim. The brief included, among other things, a timeline demonstrating that the core intellectual property for Natalie's first company had been developed and legally protected before the marriage began, a detailed accounting of the hours per week that Natalie had spent managing her business interests during the marriage, which ran on average to 62 hours per week, leaving little space for the claim that Marcus's domestic contributions had freed her to focus on business, and a characterization of Marcus's actual domestic contributions that was factually accurate and utterly damning. Marcus had not been, it turned out, a particularly active domestic partner. He had not cooked. He had not cleaned. He had not managed household logistics, finances, or maintenance. He had, by Patricia's account, been a husband in the traditional sense of the early 20th century, present in the home, earning a salary, expecting comfort, while his wife built an empire that he did not know was an empire. James Carter advised Marcus to drop the challenge. Marcus did not drop the challenge. He was too proud and too hurt and too disoriented by the sudden collapse of his understanding of his own marriage to make the pragmatic choice. He pushed forward, which meant that when the hearing on the contested settlement points was scheduled, it would proceed before a judge, and the financial disclosure that had already been devastating in a conference room would become part of a public record. Patricia was prepared for this. Natalie was prepared for this. She had, in fact, anticipated it. She knew Marcus's character, had known it for 8 years, and she had known that he would not accept the settlement. Quietly, because accepting it quietly would mean acknowledging that he had not been indispensable in the way he believed himself to be, and Marcus Reeves could not do that. Not yet. So she had prepared, as she always prepared, for the longer road. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in February. The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Beverly Whitmore, a 61-year-old black woman who had sat on the Fulton County Superior Court bench for 14 years and who had, in those 14 years, developed a reputation for patience with the parties before her and very little patience for posturing. She had read the financial disclosures. She had read Patricia's brief. She had read James Carter's response. When the parties assembled in her courtroom on that Thursday morning, Judge Whitmore looked at the papers in front of her with the expression of a woman who has seen this particular type of proceeding many times and has very clear ideas about where it is going to end. Natalie sat beside Patricia at the plaintiff's table in a deep navy suit that she had bought specifically for this occasion, not to impress, but because she was a person who believed that preparation extended to every detail of how you presented yourself in a room where your life was being decided. She had her hair down, which was unusual for her in professional settings, but Patricia had suggested it, and Natalie had considered the advice and accepted it, understanding that Patricia understood judge psychology in ways that were worth deferring to. She looked straight ahead. She did not look at Marcus, who was at the defendant's table with James Carter and his associate, all three of them in various states of tension that she could feel without looking. She was thinking, with the part of her mind that never fully turned off, about a Series B term sheet that had arrived in her inbox the previous afternoon that she needed to review by the end of the week. Patricia's opening argument was 14 minutes long. She walked Judge Whitmore through the marital history, the asset timeline, the financial disclosures, and the basis for the proposed settlement that Marcus was contesting. She was precise and measured and entirely compelling, and when she sat down, James Carter rose to present his client's position. He did it well. He was a competent attorney, and he made the best available argument for his client. But you could hear, in the courtroom, the particular sound of an argument that does not have enough behind it to carry the full weight being asked of it. It was like watching someone try to move a boulder with a very good intention. Judge Whitmore asked questions. She asked Natalie 3 questions directly, which is not standard, but which the judge was entitled to do in the Georgia family court system, and Natalie answered each one with the directness and clarity of a person who has nothing to hide and knows it. The judge asked her whether she had at any point during the marriage prevented her husband from accessing information about her financial holdings. Natalie said she had maintained separate business entities prior to the marriage that she had continued to manage independently, as was standard practice for business owners entering marriage, and that Marcus had been aware that she had business interests, though she had not shared the full scope of those interests with him. The judge asked whether Marcus had ever asked for that information. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Natalie said, "No, Your Honor." The judge looked at Marcus over her reading glasses with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely final. Marcus looked at the table. The ruling came 3 weeks later. It was 26 pages long, and it denied Marcus's challenge in its entirety, affirmed the proposed settlement framework that Patricia had structured, and awarded Natalie the marital home, which she had already been living in, alone for 4 months, and which she had already decided she would sell. The ruling included a passage, which would be read by people in Atlanta legal circles for years afterward, in which Judge Whitmore wrote that the court found no credible basis to include the premarital and separately maintained business assets of the plaintiff in the marital estate subject to equitable distribution, and further found that the defendant's claim of substantial domestic contribution to the development of those assets was unsupported by the evidence and inconsistent with the testimony presented. It was a clean, complete final ruling, and it gave Natalie Reeves her freedom in a form that left Marcus Reeves with his salary, his retirement account, and the gradual, difficult understanding of the dimensions of what he had lost. By the time the divorce was finalized in late March, Marcus had left Dominique's apartment and taken a short-term lease on a furnished 2-bedroom in Sandy Springs. He had told people, friends, colleagues, the men from his poker night who called to check in, that the divorce had been mutual, that he and Natalie had grown apart, that these things happened. He did not say the part about the $40 million. No one who had not been in that conference room or that courtroom knew the full story, but stories have a way of filling in their own outlines, and the version of events that circulated among Atlanta's black professional community carried enough of the truth to be painful. People who had respected Marcus for years were looking at him with a new kind of calculation, not hostility, but the slight recalibration that happens when someone reveals themselves to be a different size than you had assumed. Some people, frankly, were looking at Natalie with something close to awe. The spring after a divorce has a particular quality to it, a rawness, a too-muchness, as if the world has removed a layer of insulation, and every sensation arrives slightly too loud. Natalie had expected this and had prepared for it in the practical ways that she prepared for everything. She had already identified a therapist, a black woman named Dr. Simone Wallace, whose practice was in Decatur and who specialized in professional women navigating major life transitions, and she had scheduled bi-weekly sessions beginning the week after the finalization. She had already mapped out a travel schedule for the spring and summer: Lagos in April, London in May, a week in the Caribbean with her sister in July. That would give her mind new landscapes to process. She had already begun the process of listing the Buckhead house, which she did with a firm from Cascade Heights, whose lead agent had been referred to her by one of the women in her professional network, and she had already identified the Inman Park property that she planned to move into, a renovated Victorian she had owned for 2 years through her real estate holding company that she had been renting out, and that was, as of March, ready to come back to her. She was not starting over. She was starting forward. There was a difference that mattered to her deeply. Dr. Wallace was 52 years old and had the quality of stillness that the best therapists develop over time, a way of holding space in a session that made the space feel genuinely held rather than performed. In their first session, she asked Natalie what she was feeling now that the legal process was complete. Natalie thought about it with the careful deliberateness she brought to every question of consequence. She said, "I feel clear. I feel like I can see farther than I could before." Dr. Wallace said, "And beneath the clarity?" Natalie was quiet for a moment. She said, "Grief. But it is grief for the marriage I believed I was building, not for the man who turned out not to be building it with me." Dr. Wallace nodded. She said, "Those are 2 different things." Natalie said, "Yes, that distinction matters to me." They sat with that for a while. The grief was real. She did not pretend it was not. There had been a time, early in the marriage, when she and Marcus had been new to each other, when his confidence and his warmth and his particular kind of easy, bright-smiled presence in a room had delighted her. There had been a time when she had believed they were making something together. She had been aware, always, of the careful management required in a relationship where she was concealing the full scope of her financial life from her partner, and she had told herself that the right moment would come for full disclosure. that they would reach a level of trust and stability where she could open that door. She understood now, and had been understanding slowly across the 8 years of the marriage, that the right moment had never come, not because of circumstance, but because of character. She had not trusted Marcus fully, and it had turned out that the part of her that had withheld trust had been correct. That was not a simple thing to hold. The correctness of your instincts does not make the loss of what you had hoped for any lighter. It just means that you were paying attention when it mattered. She thought about Dominique in a way that was more complicated than she thought about Marcus, and she thought about Marcus enough. Dominique had been woven into the architecture of her adult life in ways that Marcus, for all his 8 years of marriage, had not been. Dominique had known her before success, before the companies, before the money, back when Natalie Reeves was a girl from West. And with big plans and second-hand textbooks, Dominique knew things about Natalie that were not in any disclosure document. The miscarriage, the year Natalie almost walked away from the second company when funding fell through, and she sat in her car in a parking deck and cried for an hour. The small and specific fears that Natalie carried about. Her own worthiness that no amount of financial success had fully quieted. Dominique had carried those things, and she had also carried the secret of what she was doing with Marcus, had carried it across 14 months of Sunday brunches and birthday dinners, and phone calls where Natalie talked about her marriage, and Dominique said, "He loves you. I can see it." She had said that. Those words. Natalie had replayed them in the therapy room of her own mind many times, trying to understand what kind of architecture of self-justification allowed a person to do that, and she had not arrived at a full understanding. Dr. Wallace said that understanding might never come completely, and that the absence of understanding did not need to prevent the presence of forward movement. Natalie was working on believing that. Meanwhile, things were not going well for Marcus and Dominique in the way that things sometimes do not go well, for two people who found each other in a fire and then had to live in the ash. What they had built between them had been sustained by its secrecy, by the charged electricity of something forbidden, by the temporary nature of their hours together that made each one feel significant. When those hours became permanent, when Marcus's navy blue Cadillac was parked outside Dominique's Midtown building every night and his dry cleaning was at her cleaner and his opinions about her decor and her cooking and her work hours were a daily presence in her apartment, the charged electricity began to ground itself in the mundane friction of two people, discovering each other's actual daily selves. Marcus was particular about how the kitchen was kept. Dominique kept the kitchen in a way that was particular in a different direction. Marcus needed the television on while he worked. Dominique needed silence. Marcus had strong feelings about how debt should be managed. Dominique had credit card balances that Marcus found irresponsible. Dominique had explained that her credit card debt was her business, and that he was a guest in her home and should govern himself accordingly. This had not gone over well. By April, 3 months into the arrangement, they were having arguments with the frequency and intensity of two people who had never intended to be tested by the ordinary. The reversal of fortune that Marcus was experiencing professionally was also not helping. His position at the bank was secure. He had not done anything that violated professional ethics, and his work performance remained strong. But the divorce, which was not secret even if the details were not universally known, had introduced a subtle change in how certain colleagues and clients related to him. He was no longer the settled, successful, Buckhead-housed married man whose personal life radiated stability. He was a man living in a furnished 2-bedroom in Sandy Springs, who had recently been divorced by a wife, who turned out to be, as one of his golf partners put it, with the unthinking brutality of men who think they are being friendly, way more set than any of us knew. That phrasing, way more set, had gotten back to Marcus through a mutual friend, and it had lodged in him, in the way that certain phrases do when they illuminate something you have been trying not to fully see about your own life. He had believed himself the architect of his household's financial future. He had believed Natalie's success was modest and secondary and something that he could afford to take for granted because his success was primary and central. He had been the breadwinner in his own mind for 8 years of a marriage in which his wife was quietly methodically building a fortune 40 times, the size of anything he had ever accumulated. That knowledge had a weight to it that did not get lighter with time. It got heavier. He called his mother. Elaine Reeves was 67 years old, a retired school principal who lived in College Park and who had loved Natalie with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who recognizes genuine quality when she encounters it. She had not known about Dominique before the divorce. She had found out the way Marcus's family found out. Because Marcus, in a moment of poor judgment, had told his brother Calvin the full story, and Calvin had told Calvin's wife, and Calvin's wife had told Elaine, and Elaine had called Marcus at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning with the particular tone in her voice that Marcus associated with report cards in 5th grade and missed curfews in 10th grade and every other occasion in his life when he had seriously disappointed a person who loved him. She had not shouted. Elaine Reeves did not shout. She had said, "Baby, what did you do?" And the way she said it, not with anger, but with genuine sorrowful bewilderment, had broken something open in Marcus that all the financial revelations and legal proceedings had not quite reached. He had told her everything. She had listened. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "And what are you going to do about the rest of your life?" He did not have an answer for her. She said, "You need to find one." She did not say anything else about Natalie or Dominique. She changed the subject to whether he was eating enough vegetables, which was its own kind of statement. Natalie, in that same April, was in Lagos for 10 days attending a conference on African fintech investment that her platform's growth had made her a significant enough figure to be invited to speak at. She gave a 20-minute presentation on financial inclusion, models for diaspora communities, that received a standing ovation from a room of 500 investors, entrepreneurs, and policymakers, and she spent the evenings eating jollof rice and pepper soup with people whose brains worked in ways that excited her and reminded her that her world was much larger than whatever was happening on the other side of a divorce proceeding in Atlanta. She video called her mother twice. She bought her father a hand-woven agbada that she knew he would wear to church and feel magnificent in. She sat on the balcony of her hotel room watching Lagos at night and felt, for the first time in a very long time, not the careful, controlled peace she had maintained through the preceding months, but something more like joy. It was cautious. It was provisional. It had the quality of a thing that was returning rather than a thing that was new. But it was real, and she held it carefully. The Series B round for her wealth management platform closed in May at $58 million. It was the largest single funding event of her professional career, and it moved her net worth into territory that required a new category of planning that she and Patricia and her CFO and her accountant worked through across several careful sessions. She called her father. Harold Reeves picked up on the second ring, and she told him the number, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Baby girl, your grandmama is somewhere real proud." Natalie said, "I know." "Daddy," he said, "you doing what she always said you would." Natalie said, "I know." He said, "You eating?" She laughed. She said, "I'm eating, Daddy." He said, "Good." They talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was everything. Marcus Reeves began the second half of the year with the slow, grinding effort of a man who is trying to reconstruct a self-image that has been fundamentally altered. He was not without resources. His salary was real. His professional standing was intact. And he had the emotional intelligence, when he chose to use it, to recognize that the story he had been telling himself about his marriage was incomplete in ways that said something about him. He had been working with a therapist of his own since April, a black man named Dr. Leonard Hayes in Buckhead, who had a directness with his male clients that Marcus sometimes found profoundly uncomfortable and had come to understand was necessary. Dr. Hayes had a phrase he used when Marcus arrived at the office with a new version of the story in which someone else was primarily responsible for where Marcus found himself. "Let's try that again from the beginning." He said it without judgment and with the patience of a man who understands that the truth arrives for most people, not in a single revelation, but in a series of approaches, each one getting a little closer to the center. Marcus had arrived for sessions with arguments about Natalie's financial concealment, about Dominique's responsibility, about the social pressures on black men to be providers in ways that made financial insecurity feel existential. Dr. Hayes had listened carefully to all of it and then said, "Let's try that again from the beginning." By summer, Marcus was beginning to approach the beginning. The relationship with Dominique ended in July, on a Tuesday evening in Midtown, with the quiet exhaustion of two people who have run out of the energy required to maintain something that was never on stable ground. There was no dramatic scene. There was no throwing of objects or screaming of accusations. Marcus came home to Dominique's apartment after a long day and found her sitting on the couch with her laptop open. And she looked up when he came in, and something in both of their faces reflected back to the other person the same knowledge at the same moment, which was that they were done. He said, "Dom." She said, "I know." He said, "I think." She said, "I know, Marcus." They were quiet for a while. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Which part?" He thought about it. He said, "All of it." She said, "Me too." He moved out the following weekend. He took his dry cleaning and his television, opinions and his particular views on kitchen organization, and he put them in the Sandy Springs apartment, and he sat in the quiet of a Tuesday evening with nothing to do and no one to be disappointed in him, and he felt something that was not quite peace, but was its absence of conflict, and he understood that he had a great deal of work to do. Dominique Carter, alone in her apartment in Midtown for the first time in months, underwent something that she would describe later to her own therapist, Dr. Yolanda Barnes, whom she began seeing in August, as a dismantling. She had told herself so many stories about what she and Marcus had been, about why she had made the choices she made, about the complicated architecture of her feelings for Natalie and her feelings for Marcus, and her feelings about her own worth and worthiness. Dr. Barnes listened to all of them with the same patient attention, and then she asked Dominique what she thought she had actually been looking for in all of it. Dominique said Marcus. Dr. Barnes said, "Before Marcus." Dominique was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, younger, less defended. She said, "I wanted to be chosen." She meant over Natalie. She meant, instead of always being the friend, the bridesmaid, the one who was smart and good and loved but always, somehow, adjacent to the life that was the real life. She had wanted to be the protagonist of something, and she had chosen the most destructive possible way to make that happen. And the protagonist of the story that had emerged from her choices was not Dominique. It had never been Dominique. It had been Natalie, moving quietly and strategically through a narrative that Dominique had thought she was disrupting, but had actually been, in some larger sense, serving. Natalie had filed for divorce the moment she was ready to. Dominique and Marcus had not made Natalie's life smaller. They had given her a reason to finally, cleanly, let go of it and build something larger. In September, Dominique wrote a letter to Natalie. It was 4 pages long, handwritten on cream stationery, and it said everything that needed to be said. The apology, the explanation that was not an excuse, the acknowledgement of the specific and irreplaceable weight of what she had destroyed, the grief of it, the sorrow that had no redemptive angle. She did not ask for forgiveness. She said she understood if it was not possible. She said she wanted Natalie to know that the friendship, 22 years of it, the real parts, the honest parts, the parts that had nothing to do with the betrayal, had been the most important friendship of her life, and that she knew she had been its assassin. She sealed the envelope. She drove to a mailbox on Ponce de Leon. She dropped it in. She stood there in the September heat for a moment, and then she got back in her car and drove home. Natalie received the letter on a Thursday. She read it twice at her kitchen table in the Inman Park Victorian, with coffee going cold beside her and Justice asleep on the new rug she had bought for the dining room. She read it a third time more slowly. She folded it along its original creases. She put it in the drawer of her desk in the study, the drawer where she kept things that required thought, the things that were not resolved but not discarded. She did not write back, not yet. She went to her next session with Dr. Wallace, and talked about the letter for most of the hour. Dr. Wallace said, "What do you want to do with it?" Natalie said, "I want to understand what I feel about it before I decide what to do with it." Dr. Wallace said, "That's a good place to start." Natalie said, "I am not ready to forgive her. I might not ever be. But I do not want to spend the next 10 years carrying the hatred of it either. I don't have the space for that." Dr. Wallace said, "What would you put in that space instead?" Natalie looked out the window of the therapy office at the Decatur street below, at the trees that were beginning to turn, at the ordinary traffic of an ordinary Thursday, in a city that had been her whole life and still managed, occasionally, to show her something new. She said, "Whatever I build next." Whatever she built next was already taking shape. The $58 million Series B had given her platform, the resources to expand into markets. She had been carefully researching, not just Atlanta, not just the Southeast, but a national rollout that would require a team of 50 new hires, a marketing operation of genuine scale, and strategic partnerships with 3 financial institutions that she had been in preliminary conversations with for months. She was also in early conversations with a publishing house about a book, a serious book, not a memoir, but a substantive examination of the financial literacy gap in Black households and the structural factors that perpetuate it, written from the perspective of both the data and the lived experience of the communities she served. She had 2 speaking invitations pending, one from the White House, which had startled her when it arrived, and one from the World Economic Forum in Davos, which had startled her, slightly less because she had seen the direction her platform's profile was moving. She was not startled exactly. She was oriented. She was pointing herself toward the next thing, and the next thing was large, and she felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, like she was moving at the speed she was actually capable of, without the weight of concealment or management, or the careful calibration of how much to show and to whom. She was done with that kind of work. She was ready for a different kind. Marcus Reeves, in October, received an email from a mutual acquaintance, a man named Devon, who had been in Marcus's MBA cohort and who had stayed connected to Natalie professionally over the years, that contained a link to a Forbes profile of Natalie Reeves. The profile was titled The Architect of the Unseen Economy, and it ran to 4,000 words and included a photograph of Natalie in a cream blazer standing in the Inman Park, Victorian's front garden, looking directly into the camera, with the kind of expression that successful people sometimes have when they have entirely stopped worrying about how they appear to others. The profile described her net worth as well north of $100 million, following the Series B round and ongoing valuations, and it described the financial wellness platform she had built as potentially the most significant contribution to Black wealth building infrastructure in the post-2020 landscape. It quoted her extensively on her philosophy of invisibility as a business strategy, how she had deliberately kept her profile low for years, how she had worked quietly while others positioned themselves noisily, how she had understood intuitively that the most dangerous thing a Black woman builder could be was visible before she was ready to withstand what visibility would bring. She said, "I let people underestimate me. It kept me safe and it kept me focused. When I was ready to be seen, I had already won the thing I was playing for." Marcus read the profile twice. He did not show it to anyone. He sat with it in the Sandy Springs apartment on a Wednesday evening with rain against the windows and the television off, which was new. The television had been off a lot lately, and he read it again. He felt many things. He felt pride, which surprised him, and then did not, because Natalie Reeves had been his wife, and she was extraordinary, and the fact of what they had been to each other did not disappear because of how it ended. He felt grief, which was familiar now and had a different texture than it had in the fall. Less sharp, more wide, the grief of understanding what he had and what he had done with it. He felt something he could not name for a long time, sitting there with the rain and the quiet and the Forbes profile on his phone screen, and eventually he understood what it was. Respect. Deep, uncomplicated, honest respect for a woman who had never needed him to see her clearly in order to be exactly who she was. He set the phone down. He looked at the rain on the window. He thought about what his mother had asked him in the spring. What are you going to do about the rest of your life? He had been answering that question slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of backward slides and a lot of Dr. Hayes's patient, let's try that again from the beginning. But he thought, sitting in the rain light with the television off, that he might finally be approaching something that resembled a real answer. Atlanta in December has a quality that cities further north do not fully appreciate. The light is different, lower and more golden than in summer, and the trees that hold their leaves into late fall have turned, colors that seem to deepen rather than pale, rusts and ambers, and the occasional flash of red, maple that stops you on a sidewalk and makes you look longer than you intended to. Natalie Reeves walked to work on the mornings she could, which were most mornings now, because the Inman Park Victorian was 11 minutes from her. Company's new offices on Edgewood Avenue, offices she had just moved her team into in November, a full floor of a converted warehouse. Building with exposed brick and high ceilings and windows along the east wall that brought the morning light in at an angle that made even budget spreadsheets look like poetry. She walked those 11 minutes with Justice on his leash, dropping him at the building's ground floor, daycare space that the landlord had thoughtfully included, and she walked up the stairs to the second floor, and she stood at her desk at 8 in the morning and felt, with a regularity that she was still adjusting to because it was unfamiliar, good, not strategically composed, not carefully controlled, good. She had not written back to Dominique. It was December, and the letter had arrived in September, and she still had not written back, and she had made peace with the possibility that she might not. Dr. Wallace had said, across several sessions, that forgiveness was not a destination that had to be reached on any particular schedule or in any particular form, that it sometimes arrived as a gradual loosening rather than a moment of declared release, and that the work of it was internal rather than relational, that it had more to do with what Natalie was carrying than with anything she owed Dominique. Natalie thought about this a great deal. She was not carrying rage. She was not carrying grief the way she had been. What she was carrying, she thought, was something closer to a scar, the evidence of something that had healed, that still had a shape under the skin, that reminded you occasionally, and then did not, that did not limit motion, but was part of the body now. She could live with that. She could build with that. The White House trip was in late January. She had accepted the invitation, which was connected to an initiative on financial inclusion in underserved communities, and she would be part of a roundtable that included several economists, 2 other fintech founders, and a roster of policy advocates whose work she had followed for years. She was preparing remarks. She had drafted them 3 times, so far, and discarded each draft because it was too safe, too polished, too much the kind of language that fills rooms comfortably and changes nothing. She wanted her 4th draft to say something true. She was working on it. Her mother had come to the new office and walked through every room with her hands pressed together and her eyes full of tears that she refused to let fall, which was the most Cynthia thing possible. She had stood at the east windows in the morning light and looked out at Edgewood Avenue and said, "You were always going to get here." Natalie had stood beside her and said, "I know, Mama." Cynthia had put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they had stood there together for a while, and it was not a small thing. It was the whole thing, really, the whole story. Harold Reeves wore the agbada to church the Sunday before Christmas, and the photograph that Natalie's mother sent to the family group chat showed him standing in the sanctuary foyer looking like the king of something, which was exactly what Natalie had intended when she bought it. She saved the photograph to her camera roll and looked at it at odd moments throughout the day with the particular pleasure of a gift that landed exactly right. Marcus Reeves called her on a Saturday in early December. She almost did not answer. She had his number still. She had not deleted it, which was not sentiment, but rather the practical decision of a person who does not believe in creating false cleanness where the actual past remains complicated. She stared at the phone for 3 rings, and then she answered. He said, "Natalie." She said, "Marcus." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I read the Forbes piece." She said, "I know." She did not know how she knew, but she did. He said, I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for everything, because there's too much and I don't think a phone call covers it. But I wanted to say it. She was quiet. She looked out the window of the Victorians, study at the December light on the street. She said, I hear you, Marcus. He said, How are you? She said, I'm well. I'm actually very well. He said, Good. That's good. Nat, she said, take care of yourself. Marcus, he said, Yeah, you too. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and picked up her White House remarks and read them from the beginning. She threw out that draft too. She opened a new document. She started from the line that had been sitting in her mind for 3 months, the one she had been circling, and not quite letting herself use, because it was too close to her own experience, and she was still learning, still in the practice of saying the true thing without the armor of distance. The line was this: the most radical financial act available to a black woman in America is to know exactly what she is worth and tell absolutely no one until she is ready. She typed it. She looked at it. She left it on the page. She kept writing. Justice, from his bed in the corner of the study, lifted his head and looked at her with the alert, amber-eyed gaze of a dog who is paying attention. She looked back at him. She said, Don't look at me like that. He wagged once and put his head back down. She turned back to the screen. The December light moved across the room as the morning advanced, changing the color of the brick and the angle of the shadows. And Natalie Reeves sat in it and worked, and the work was good, and the life she was building was hers, in a way that it had never quite been before. Fully, completely, without concealment or management, or the careful division of herself into the version that was known and the version that was real. She was, at last, one whole thing. She had paid for that wholeness in the currency that life extracts from people who reach it, in loss and grief and the long labor of honest reckoning, and she held it now like something hard-won, which is the only way it can ever truly be held. What they had thought they'd taken from her had turned out to be the smallest part of what she was. What they had done, Marcus and Dominique, in those 14 months of hotel, rooms and careful lies and the particular cruelty of a betrayal committed by people who knew you well enough to know exactly where it would hurt, had been intended, consciously or not, to diminish her. It had not diminished her. It had clarified her. It had stripped away the last of the weight she had been carrying in a marriage that she had been trying to make work with a man who would never fully understand the person she actually was, and it had sent her back to herself, which was the place she had always been most powerful. The revenge, if you called it that, was not what happened in the conference room or the courtroom or the Forbes profile. The revenge was the December morning and the east window light and the document open on the screen and the work that was going to matter, that was going to reach people who needed what she had built and change the shape of what was possible for them. The revenge was that she was free, and she knew what to do with freedom, and she was doing it. She was Natalie Reeves. She had always been exactly this. She had simply been patient enough to let the world catch up. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman who has arrived, not at a destination, because people like Natalie Reeves do not have destinations. They have directions, but at herself. It is not the silence of loss. It is not the silence of grief. It is the silence of a woman who has done the work, survived the fire, walked out the other side, and stood in December light in a room she owns in a life she built, and looked at the road, ahead without fear and without pretense and without the weight of anyone else's definition of what she should be. It is a silence that sounds, to those who have earned it, like the beginning of everything. That was the silence that lived inside Natalie Reeves, and she wore it like a crown. And so the story ends, not with a war cry, not with a courtroom explosion, not with the kind of dramatic collapse that people expect when betrayal reaches this level. It ends with a woman in December light, at a desk she owns, in a life she built, writing the truest sentence she has ever written. It ends with justice, not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet, irrevocable kind that only comes to people who are disciplined enough to wait for it. Now let us talk about what this story really taught us. The first lesson is this: never let anyone's underestimation of you become your limitation. Natalie Reeves was in that marriage for 8 full years, building quietly, moving carefully, accumulating something extraordinary, while the people closest to her assumed she was ordinary. She did not correct them. She did not need their validation to keep building. She understood something that very few people truly grasp, that the most powerful position in any room is the one nobody's watching. If you are being underestimated right now, do not waste your energy being angry about it. Use that invisibility. Build in it. Let them sleep on you. The reveal will come on your terms. The second lesson is this. Your peace is worth more than your pride. Natalie could have confronted Marcus the night she saw that car in the parking garage. She could have screamed, cried, thrown everything into chaos. She chose instead to be quiet, to be strategic, to protect herself completely before she made a single move. There is a difference between walking away in weakness and walking away in power. Natalie never ran from anything. She simply refused to fight a battle on terrain that had not been prepared by her own hands. The third lesson is this. The people who betray you are not your story. Marcus and Dominique thought they were the protagonists of something. They were not. They were the circumstance that freed Natalie to become the full version of herself without compromise or concealment. The betrayal did not define her. What she built after it did. Do not let what someone did to you become the headline of your life. Let what you do next be the headline. And the fourth lesson, perhaps the most important one, is this. A black woman who knows her worth, protects her peace, and moves in purpose is an unstoppable force. Not because she is without pain, not because she is without grief, but because she has learned to carry those things and keep going, and in the going, she becomes something that no betrayal, no courtroom, no stolen husband, and no broken friendship can reduce. That is Natalie Reeves, and somewhere out there, watching this right now, that is also you. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in you, if it made you sit up a little straighter and think about your own quiet power, then do one thing before you close this screen. Hit that subscribe button, because we tell stories here that are built for people who refuse to be broken. Stories about resilience, about reckoning, about the kind of strength that does not announce itself until the moment it absolutely has to. We tell stories about real people, real choices, and real consequences, and we are just getting started. The next story is already coming, and when it drops, you are going to want to be here for it. It is bigger, it is deeper, it is going to keep you up past your bedtime, and we would not have it any other way. Subscribe, turn on your notifications, share this with somebody who needs to hear that their silence is not weakness. It is strategy, and we will see you in the next one, because the best chapters are always still ahead.